What frameworks are used for testing Spring MVC components? For testing Spring MVC components, we typically use JUnits, which helps check small parts of our application independently. Mogito is another tool used to create fake versions of the parts of our app, interacts with and allowing us to test each piece separately. Spring Test Mock MVC is also useful as it lets us create our own test for our controllers by simulating HTTP requests and checking the responses. These tools help make sure each part of our app works right at the right direction. How can you mock Spring MVC dependencies for unit testing? To mock dependencies in Spring MVC for unit testing, we can also use Mockito to create fake versions of the services or databases that our controllers use. Start by @WebMVC test on our test class to set up testing an environment for just the MVC parts. Then add @mockbin to our test class to replace each services with these mocks. This allows us to control how these dependencies behave during testing, making sure our controllers act correctly. What are the best practices for integration testing in Spring MVC? So for a good integration testing in Spring MVC, here are some key tips. Use the @Spring Boot test annotation to test how all the parts of our application work together. Use tools like test REST template or mock MVC to mimic sending HTTP requests and checking the responses. Keep our testing environment separate from our production environment to avoid mixing data. Always clean up our test data after test to prevent issues. Make sure to test how different parts of our application interact and handle data. Explain how Spring MVC supports file upload. Spring MVC supports file uploads, that is uploading files by using a multi-part file interface. First, we create a form on our web page that can send files, making sure to set encryption type is equal to multi-part / form data. So this one we need to set it as a encryption type. In our Spring controller, we use @request param to link a method parameter to the file input field on our form. This way, when the file is uploaded, the multi-part file parameter in our method captures the file's data, letting us work with it in our application. What configurations are needed to enable file uploads in Spring MVC application? To set up file uploads in Spring MVC application, we need to do following things. That is, add a multi-part resolver bin to our Spring configuration file. For newer servers, that is, we need to use a Servlet 3.0 plus versions. We can use a standard Servlet multi-part resolver. If we are using Spring Boot, we might also need to enable multi-part uploads in our application settings. Make sure our HTML form that uploads the file as encryption type equals to multi-part form data. Next, we need to set the limit for how big the uploaded files can be and how much data can be sent per request to manage resources properly. So we need to set the limit to upload the files and the sending the files to resources. How can you handle file upload in controller? To handle file uploads in a Spring MVC controller, create a method that takes a multi-part file as a parameter that is labeled with @request param. Make sure our HTML form for uploading files that specifies encryption type equals to multi-part form data and the name of the form's file input matches the @request param name. In this method, we can use the multi-part file to save the file, check its types, or do any other processing our application needs. What are the common issues faced during file uploads and their solutions? So while uploading a files, what are the issues we may face and how can we solve that? So we can see here the common problems with file uploads that includes files being too large, uploading the wrong file types, and uploading taking too long. To fix these, we can set limits on how large files can be and check the files are correct type before accepting them. For slow uploads, we might need to adjust our server to wait longer before timeout, especially if we are dealing with big files or slow internet connections. How can Spring MVC be integrated with other technologies like JPA or WebSocket? So Spring MVC can work with JPA, that is Java Persistent API, to handle database operations easily using a Spring Data JPA. For real-time communication, it can integrate with WebSocket by using Spring's at enable WebSocket annotation and WebSocket configurer interface. This setup allows us to build web applications that efficiently manage data and support real-time updates between the server and clients. What are the common advanced features or techniques in Spring MVC that are useful for high traffic applications? For high traffic applications, Spring MVC offers advanced features like handling long running tasks without blocking using asynchronous processing, reducing database load with caching, and managing resources efficiently with connection pooling. Other useful techniques include optimizing RESTful services, using content negotiation to serve different data formats, and securing the application with Spring Security for strong authentication and authorization. How can caching be implemented in Spring MVC? To implement caching in Spring MVC, we first enable caching by adding @enable caching in our configuration class. Then we use @cacheable annotation on method to cache their results. For example, we need to use @cacheable. Inside that, we need to use a parameter, that is, for example, items. We'll cache the output for that particular method. We can use different caching providers like EHCache, Redis Cache, or Hazel Cache to store the cache data. What are the strategies for asynchronous processing in Spring MVC? In Spring MVC, we can use callable dereferred results and web async tasks to handle tasks asynchronously. These methods run in a separate thread, so the main thread can handle our requests. We can also use the @async annotation to run methods in the background. So we can use @async annotation to run the methods in the background. So these strategies help our application to handle more requests by not blocking any methods. Any methods means we can many thread with long running tasks. How can you scale a Spring MVC application horizontally? To scale a Spring MVC application horizontally, run multiple copies of the app on different servers and use a load balancer to share the traffic. Make sessions stateless or store them in a distributed systems like Redis. Manage the database by replicating or dividing it to handle more data. Breaking the application into smaller microservices can also help with scaling.